The former BC Liberal Party is in crisis.
I'm so pleased today to have Eleanor Sturco agree to come over and join the Conservative Party of British Columbia.
Making this decision was really difficult. And even today, I mean, I have colleagues standing in the crowd here, former colleagues, and it's tough because I've enjoyed working with them. You know, we can only ignore the polls for so long.
Eleanor Sturco became the latest BC United MLA to defect to the BC Conservatives. That's a total of 3 defections in less than a year. The move comes as BC United gets trounced in the polls, trailing the Conservatives in one survey by as many as 14 points. All of this happening ahead of a BC election this October. Kevin Falcon is the BC United leader. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Kevin, 3 of your MLAs have defected to the BC Conservatives in less than a year. What's going on here? Why are you losing your people?
Well, this kind of thing happens. I mean, look, the BC Conservative Party, which is not connected to the federal party, lost 3 people, mostly because of extremist statements and beliefs that they held. The NDP lost 2 people to sit as independents. These kind of things happen in politics. I mean, it's just another day in the week of BC politics. One
of the defectors, Eleanor Sturco, was a bit of a star candidate for you guys, and she says she's leaving now because it's the Conservatives who are best placed to defeat the NDP in the fall. And she says you personally are not resonating with voters. What do you say to Ms. Sturco?
Well, look, I try not to be critical of any current or former MLAs. All I'll say with, in the case of Eleanor, she's a member of the LGBTQ community. She just joined a party that has been one of the most anti-LGBTQ parties that you can possibly imagine. The views that have been expressed by their own candidates, one of whom called her a woke lesbian culture warrior, is at best a strange place for her to end up. I do think at the end of the day, principles and values matter. And, I wouldn't trade my principles or my values. I'd rather lose elections than do that, to be honest with you. I'm not sure how she can feel entirely comfortable over there, but that's a decision she has the right to make. Whether the public supports it is a whole nother question.
Yeah, as you say, there were some of those off-color comments. One Conservative candidate also said, describing Pride participants as degenerates and perverts who expose themselves to children for kicks. As you say, another candidate describing Ms. Sturco as a woke lesbian social justice warrior. Are you saying that the Conservative Party is not a safe space for gay people?
I'm saying that is not a bug, but a feature, unfortunately, of many of their candidates. And at the end of the day, one thing I know about British Columbia is this. They don't like extremes, not extreme left or extreme right. And right now we've got the extreme left with David Eby and the NDP, and the extreme right with John Rustad, the leader of that party, and a former colleague of mine, I hasten to add, who was a BC Liberal for almost 20 years, but has now become a climate denier. He just doesn't even accept that climate change is real, and it's certainly not human caused, and he thinks it's not a crisis at all. And I think that those kind of opinions, frankly, don't play well with mainstream British Columbians. And that's why I remain very confident that when the public starts paying attention, as we come closer to the next election, we're still 4.5 months away, I feel very confident they'll go for the mainstream, not the extreme.
You said late last year you don't spend much time thinking about the Conservatives. Now they have a 20-point lead over your party. Did you drop the ball here, Kevin? Should you have taken them more seriously than you did?
Well, this is, it's not the first time we've had a party with more than a 10 or 20-point lead over us. It depends on which poll you look at. Honestly, I can just tell you this. When I retired as finance minister in 2012, the 2013 election, we were 23 points down in the polls going into the election campaign itself. Nobody thought the BC Liberals would win. We won a majority. Election campaigns matter for a reason. We just saw in India that, Modi was supposed to win a landslide election, but it turns out the polls were wrong. And it was anything but. So I just think we should be a little careful putting too much stock in polls 4.5 months from an election.
But do you regret maybe not taking them seriously enough? Because obviously some of your voters have bled over into the Conservatives. They're looking to back them now in this election.
Well, actually, you have to be careful there too, because I actually don't accept that. Because I think actually what's happening is Pierre Poilievre and the Federal Conservative Party are actually very popular in BC right now. And a lot of the people that think they're supporting the Federal Conservatives are actually in polls ending up supporting BC Conservatives because they happen to have the same name. The parties are not connected in any way. In fact, the BC Conservative Party has not elected a candidate in British Columbia in almost 50 years. And so it's important to understand that that distinction will get cleared up by the time we get to the election. I have little doubt about that. And this has happened in the past, even in the 2013 campaign. We were tied with the BC Conservatives, a year and half a year out from the election. So it's not uncommon in BC.
I take your point that you think you can win it, and maybe the polls are wrong. And you have, though, explored a merger with the Conservatives. It seems like that plan has kind of been put on ice. But are you open to any sort of formal cooperation? Because a divided center-right vote, that's great news for the NDP, isn't it?
Yeah, and a very good point. Yes, it is. It's great news for the NDP. And that's why we didn't discuss a merger, because I can't merge. I've always been very clear about this. I can't merge with a party that has a bunch of candidates that don't share my basic values and principles. So that's a no-go. But what we did say is that we were prepared to have a discussion to see if we could develop a framework where we at least identify ridings in which we're not competing against each other, so that we don't allow the NDP to win seats that they otherwise wouldn't win. Now, that framework that we put forward based on discussions we had with representatives of both teams, John Rustad, who's the leader of the BC Conservative Party, rejected that out of hand. It's his right to do so. I think it was a big mistake on his part, because we were literally putting the broader public interest ahead of our own narrow partisan or party interests.
Because if the polls stay where they are now, it looks like NDP could be reelected. You need people to coalesce around one party, don't you? That should be the goal.
Yeah, of course, that's always the goal. But I also have to tell you something this is really dead true. The response we're getting on the doorstep and the response we're getting from our voter identification efforts are totally the opposite of what's happening in the polls. It feels very much like what happened in 2013, when all the polls were saying we were going to lose badly, but our internal voter ID was going really well. We're seeing the same thing happen right now. So the only thing I would say is just, be very, very cautious about polls, because internet polls are just not like the polls of old. The accuracy can vary tremendously, especially when there's voter confusion over a basic fact, which is a lot of the voters are thinking federal Conservative and Pierre Poilievre. They're not thinking about the BC Conservative Party. And in fact, most of the public, over half the public, couldn't even name who the leader of the BC Conservative Party is. That's the voter confusion that's happening right now.
You're speaking about brand there, the Conservatives sharing a brand and at least a name. As you mentioned, Conservatives, they were a marginal force in the province for decades, and then your party changes its name. You drop the Liberal moniker. You go by United instead. Do you think that any of the place you're at in the polls can be tied back to that rebrand? Do you regret dropping Liberal and going with United?
No, I don't regret dropping Liberal, only because, quite honestly, the BC Liberal Party, just like the BC Conservative Party, was not connected to the federal party. We were always a coalition party that followed in the footsteps of what was once called Social Credit here in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. So the coalition never changed, but I can tell you that if we had the Liberal brand today, it probably would not really be helpful, given what's going on right now. The federal Liberal brand in British Columbia is challenged right now, to be candid. And so I think it's important to understand that United, the BC United, I think that the idea of uniting people and not dividing is actually really important to me and to our team. We want to bring British Columbians together. It's not always easy. Increasingly, social media, it's easy to polarize the province. But, frankly, I do think people want to unite. And admittedly, yes, it hurts us in the short term, because not everyone understands who BC United is. But as we get closer and closer to the election and people start paying more attention, because they're not right now, which is understandable, but when they do, they'll look around and they'll say, wait a minute, those two parties, that's extreme left, extreme right. No, we want mainstream. And if we go forward with sound, solid policies and very good candidates like we have, doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs and teachers and unionized train operators and others, then I feel very confident that we'll get the result that we look for.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Kevin Falcon, BC United leader. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks so much for having me, JP.
The power panel is going to weigh in on this. Shachi Curl, Andrew Thompson, James Moore, and Carleen Varayan are back with me. Shachi, I'll start with you. What are the polls saying? Are the BC United in contention to form government after this coming election, or is it looking a little different?
No, not at the moment. BC United is in a very difficult position in terms of polling today. And of course, all the caveats around, there's a long time left before October. But what is particularly difficult and alarming for BC United supporters, strategists, and indeed Leader Kevin Falcon is that the party has slipped to third place in terms of vote intention. The last time we did a measure, it was tied for second place with the BC Conservatives. It's now running coming at a distant third. This has created all kinds of pressure and problems for BC United. It's a party that's being squeezed on a number of fronts. You see Kevin Falcon talking about the LGBTQ2 issue. You know, it's a party that's trying to be right of center while still reflecting, call it modern or urban or left of center social values. It's also a party that's trying desperately to stay relevant in Metro Vancouver, while so much of its support has bled in the interior, in the north, and in more rural parts of the province to the BC Conservatives. So what he's trying to do at this point, and you can argue perhaps not very successfully given those polling numbers, that he's trying to say, look, you can oppose the NDP, you can be to the right of center of the NDP, but not be so far to the right of center of the BC Conservatives. At the moment, however, it is not a particularly compelling message, especially, and we've talked about this in past weeks, when you have a situation where in the past, federal Conservatives and federal Conservative grandees have really rallied around what was then the BC Liberals, that same party now named BC United, and said, look, a vote for the BC Conservatives, a party that's been around but hasn't really had much power since 1928, to split the vote is really to hand a victory to the New Democrats. You're not hearing that right now at that level from federal grandees, and I think that's significant. The branding of the party provincially, the BC Conservatives, has been something that has really elevated it in terms of the popularity as well of the federal Conservatives in this moment. So there's a lot of shifts happening. I want to say one more thing. It's important to kind of get the basis or the baseline established. What's really key here is the fact that nearly half of BC Conservatives say if it came to an NDP win, they would consider abandoning the BC Conservatives and going back to BC United. Half of BC United supporters say the same thing about the BC Conservatives. So the amount of shifting that could continue to take place below the surface is really important to watch.
James, you're our BC guy. What's going on here? 3 defections. The poll numbers aren't good. I mean, depending on which one you read, the BC United are either 14, 15, 20 points back from the BC Conservatives. Why have they fallen apart?
It's awesome, right? I mean, and I know it's not, the irony is not lost that you rebrand your party from BC Liberal to BC United, and it hasn't been more disunited in 30 years. But here we are, and the BC United Party, I think, has had a tough go for a bunch of reasons. Chief among them is that if you're going to rebrand your party to BC United, you have to be really clear about what you're uniting around. What are you united for? What are you united against? Who are you united for? Who are you united against? And they haven't filled in any of those blanks. Shachi says that there's a sweet spot traditionally in BC politics where you're economically on the free enterprise side, but socially you're more moderate. Well, economically today, Kevin Falcon announced that the BC United Party would make even more progressive the $10 per day daycare and pay out the $10 cost for families to have daycare. I mean, that's not something that British Columbia can afford. It's not something that we can do. It's not something that a fiscally responsible party would advocate for. And then he talks about the importance of unity. And then Eleanor Sturko, who's a former member of the RCMP, who's a married lesbian mom from his old neighborhood of Surrey, who he put into a senior shadow cabinet portfolio. He says that she's not being an adequate member of the LGBTQ community. Like, how dare you say that? Who are you to make that kind of a proclamation against somebody else who's had the struggles professionally and personally that Eleanor Sturko has had, who you put into a shadow cabinet role? And you're the leader of the BC United. It's pretty appalling and unnecessary. So the center right, the Free Enterprise Coalition, is broken. And I don't think it's the only person who's going to benefit from all this politically will be David Eby, who sees disunity on the right. And it's unfortunate because British Columbia deserves a clear choice in the next campaign.
Well, I guess we know where you fall now. I thought maybe you would be a BC United, but you seem steadfast.
Well, Kevin Falcon, look, that's why I'm disappointed. Kevin Falcon's a friend of mine, and I've always thought that he would make a good premier. But the way that this party has been managed, the way in which he's treated when you're your caucus chair and a star member of your shadow cabinet, you treat her like this in public in that interview that I just saw. With respect, I think that's appalling, and I think that's to challenge somebody's loyalty to their community in that kind of a personal way. I think that's really ugly.
Carleen, what do you make of the party ditching the Liberal brand? They basically didn't want to be associated with the federal Liberals. He told me that again today. He said that's a bit toxic here in BC right now. Do you think it was a smart thing to dump something that they've had for decades and go with United?
Well, the BC Liberal Party hasn't been a Liberal party in probably over a decade now when it comes to ideology, but changing a party's name is always difficult in terms of ensuring that you're able to get sufficient brand penetration for your new party name in time for the next election. BC United is facing a bit of a brand crisis on two fronts. First of all, I don't think that they've achieved that full kind of penetration of the new brand name. There's some confusion there. And then second of all, as Scotchy alluded to, the BC Conservatives are benefiting from the rising popularity of the federal Conservatives in British Columbia. I also do want to agree completely with James. I was really shocked to see that interview clip that you just aired with Kevin Falcon and his characterization of Eleanor Sturko. I don't think that that's an appropriate or effective way for a leader to communicate. And if that's sort of the approach that he's been taking, I'm not totally surprised that he's struggling. I will say I think that another really fundamental issue that BC United has right now that is independent of who's in the leader's chair of the party is that they don't have a spot to live in on the ideological spectrum. David Eby and his iteration of the NDP party have fully occupied the center at this point. So Kevin Falcon is still trying to argue for the middle, but that's already taken up by the NDP. And so who are Conservative voters going to vote for? Conservative-minded voters, I should say. Are you going to go for Diet Coke, or are you just going to go for the real thing? People are running out of reasons to cast their ballot for BC United candidates, and I think that's going to be a real problem.
Andrew, the provincial NDP must love what's going on here, a divided center-right vote, and yet the province is dealing with an overdose crisis, a failed drug legalization program, homelessness is rampant, housing affordability is a big issue, and yet the premier could coast to another victory because he's facing a divided opposition. He must be happy with what's happening here.
Well, and also he's been running a relatively competent government. I mean, he's been running one that has been able to address a lot of the other issues on housing and other issues that different provincial premiers have really struggled with. And I think, that is, yes, there are always issues when you're in government. There's always problems that, are going to be there largely regardless of which party's in office, and you've got to address those. But this, I think, is coming down in a lot of ways to a question of leadership. And one of the problems that both BC United have and the BC Conservatives is neither of those parties have leaders that are particularly endearing to the public. And so this is raising a number of questions, I think, within that group of the electorate that, are swing voters and do think, well, maybe they want to support Dave Eby in the, this version of the NDP. Maybe they want something different. When they're looking at the leaders, though, I think they've got to be going, pretty strongly and thinking now is just not the time to change to one of these other parties that just can't seem to get their internal act together. Ideologically, this has been a fight going on within the right for 30 years. This kind of forced marriage between the Reform and Conservatives sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It doesn't seem to last for long when it does come together, and that seems to be what we're seeing here is, again, the decoupling. But if your party is only consolidated around a hatred for the other party and not around a particular set of issues and ideologies and views and an outlook, then I think you're going to have a real problem attracting voters, and that's what's happening here.
Shachi, Kevin Falcon has been saying that the only reason the BC Conservatives are really doing as well as they're doing now is because of Pierre Poilievre. He's riding their coattail, or they're riding his coattails, and that's what's boosted the brand. Is that what polls are saying, or are they just kind of happy with the BC Conservative brand provincially? Like, what do we know about the stability?
They don't know what the BC Conservative brand is provincially. The majority, we've got data that shows that the majority of British Columbians cannot match BC Conservative leader John Rustad's face to his party. When you say, here's a picture of somebody, here's the name of the party, drag your mouse and match them, they can't do it. They don't know who he is. They don't know what the party really stands for in terms of policy. They don't know who the candidates are. And none of that is necessarily bad or wrong or something to be dismissed or diminished outright. We saw the Reform Party basically come out of nowhere to form a very robust caucus. We saw the same thing with the NDP in Alberta provincially. So parties can literally pop up overnight like those air blow-up guys that you see sometimes on the top of those car dealerships, right? They just sort of rise out of nowhere. However, what I'm trying to say is that there is still a significant amount of softness, of shift, of space for right-of-center voters to change their minds. The numbers today are really bad, and where they are particularly dangerous for BC United. And by the way, we did the polling on the name change. It made no difference one way or the other. It made people no more or no less likely to vote for BC United at the time. People were pretty perplexed by the name change, but it's not a significant factor in the downfall of BC United. In fact, it is a lot of what we're seeing, a further pulling and hardening to the right among conservative-minded voters. You're seeing that federally, you're seeing that provincially. The branding that is aligned, the fact that Pierre Poilievre and other conservative MPs are not out there saying, look, this is the BC United is the free enterprise party. And in terms of leadership, we've heard a little bit about this. You know, Kevin Falcon has been a long-time politician in British Columbia. So is John Rustad, by the way. But Falcon's at different times been better known. Finance minister, transport minister, has carried some very heavy files. But he's not somebody, I think, who ever really excelled at retail politics and around the emoting that perception of maybe humility or warmth or connection. And that may really be something that's he's challenged by profoundly in terms of caucus management and in terms of what he's putting out there as evidenced by that interview.
James, quick final word to you. Can the party translate this support into results? Do they have the infrastructure to actually deliver on Election Day? The Conservatives.
The BC Conservatives? Yeah. I mean, you know, British Columbia is also a province where we entertain new political options all the time, you know, from, you know, NDP, Progressive Conservative, Conservative Reform, federally, Reform provincially, Progressive Democratic Alliance, BC Liberal, BC, like we're kind of agnostic to brand, but we're pretty hard when it comes to identifying values and who the real players are. And that's why I think Eleanor Sturko and other MLAs crossing the floor do add credibility. The Conservative brand has record high credibility in the past 20 years right now across the country because of the work Pierre Poilievre is doing in the dynamic federally. So the brand is getting an open door presented to it by the voters in British Columbia. Eleanor Sturko, others crossing the floor means that they gain more credibility. So the voters are giving them a look. And it's up to the Conservative Party in British Columbia to put forward a credible plan, a credible governing alternative, and to step through the breach that's being created by BC United not catching fire.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you so much, guys. Good discussion tonight. Thanks to the Power Panel. Carlene, James, Andrew, and Shachi. Appreciate your time tonight, guys.